Hi everyone, this is Brett Hancock, and we're back here with Divorce and Remarriage. Continue on with Part 3C, and immediately we're going to pick up right where we left off with Part 3B. And again, we're going over 1 Corinthians 7. We're focusing on Paul's words. In this segment, we're going to be focusing on verses 16 through 28. And again, we're continuing on with comparing NIV versus NASB versus Good News Translation versus the ESV versus Authorized King James Version. Once we get to this segment, verses 28 through 25 through 28, there's a controversial little block there, and it really kind of pivots between whether we're talking about a single couple, a virgin to an unmarried man, and when it's using the verb that's rightly translated as bound, is that an engagement sort of idea, or are we talking about somebody that's bound in the sense of somebody being married? And so Goon A in the New Testament means woman, but sometimes the context will kind of say, hey, I think we're talking about a wife, and likewise for a husband, aner means, man, but sometimes the context conveys the idea we're talking about a husband. And so, like even in English, although it's a little archaic, people don't really say it much anymore, but somebody might say, hey, this is my man, this is my woman, and nowadays, and probably the last 30 years or something like that, it's become pretty popular for just single people to say that, just talking about girlfriend, boyfriend type thing. Oh, this is my man, this is my woman. But in many decades past, it pretty much just said that when you were talking about being married. And that's pretty much, I guess, what we're talking about here. But it just seems like translations just make it clearer by saying, hey, Goon A in this context, oh, it's wife, and they translate it as that, or on there they might translate it as husband in a certain married context. So that's the idea. Are we talking about somebody that's engaged, or are we talking about somebody that's bound through marriage, where it's one flesh, where God has joined them? And then, of course, as we start moving from verse 25, which says, now concerning virgins, setting the stage for what we're talking about here, and that should give us a clue of which of the two choices we're talking about. And as we're moving towards verse 28, and we're talking about the different things, and it's using the two, uh, you know, verbs there that sometimes in the New Testament are referred to the context of marriage. So again, the one that's for bound versus the one that is luo, which is the root word that's talking about being loosed, or if it's got apo in front of it, which is just a preposition, it's just a prefix that kind of is, instead of just being loose, it's loose from, and that's usually translated as divorce, and that's used in the four passages in the Gospels. But you know, luo all by itself for somebody to treat it the same way. I mean that's that's reasonable, totally reasonable. You don't have to have apo in front of it. However, when you look at everything, the internal evidence, everything we're going to look at, it really starts to look really clear that everything points to the fact that we're talking about engagement. We're not talking about marriage. Because then as we move towards verse 28, and it says, but if you've married, you have not sinned, that telegraphs the idea that if you are talking about a married couple, and then you're suggesting that luo means divorce, then you're talking about remarriage. And so that type of translation opens that door, and it fans into flame the idea of an exception clause in Matthew 19:9. The exception clause saying, hey, that as long as the woman is committing porneia, hey, I can go divorce and remarry. The husband can go divorce and remarry. And so that's the exception clause. And so we're going to look at that thoroughly in part 5 and look at the oldest Greek manuscripts we have to see, wow, did they have what we have in these other Greek manuscripts that we all have in every Bible? I mean, the King James Bible uses Textus Receptus. Well, when Erasmus used those 12th century manuscripts that he had, just a handful that he had, and he kind of made a little critical text out of those. Just like in the modern day, we've got over 5,800 manuscripts that they've made a critical text out of those, based on just a committee decision process, verse by verse type thing. And so Erasmus was kind of converging those manuscripts together. I mean, he has that as well, that sort of idea. So, so that's the bottom line we're going to look at is should this rightly be translated as engagement, or should it be rightly translated as marriage? One of the translations we're going to look at conveys as an engagement or betrothal, and the other four translations make it look like it's marriage, and if it's marriage, then that's pointing to remarriage, because it says if you marry, you have not sinned. So we're going to take a look at that. Okay, so picking up in verse 16, we'll start off here with Authorized King James. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? And what knowest thou, whether, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? Okay, so this, in contrast to what we've been talking about becoming sanctified, the Holy Spirit of God in the believer coming together with the unbeliever, that there is a supernatural thing there for holy offspring going on there, but that doesn't mean the person is saved. So, they kind of all read very similar. For how do you know, wife, whether you save your husband? How do you know, husband, whether you save your wife? Kind of thing. They're pretty much all reading very similar. And moving on from there, verse 17. But as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let them walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. These other translations pretty much read the same. Here we'll go over here, NIV. Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I laid down in all the churches. Here, NASB. Only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each. In this manner I let him walk, and so I direct in all the churches. So they're all kind of reading very similar there. Only let a person, here we go, ESV, only let a person lead the life the Lord has assigned to them. Starting from the beginning, the whole recommendation to be single sort of thing, and of course he's going to bring it down to a point down here where verse 28 not verse 28, let's see, I think it is. Those who marry will face troubles in this life. I want to spare you this. This whole periodic undertone, undercurrent of this whole chapter has to do with, remaining single, but not a requirement. Going down here to verse, I think it was verse 28, where he makes it real clear, and he's like, okay, verse 1, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Verse 8, it's good for the unmarried and the widows to remain that way. But, because you lack self-control, if that happened to be the case, then, by all means get married if that's what you need to do. Because it's better to, if you can't be self-controlled, it's better to be married than to burn. And so, I don't know, consider what Jesus says in Matthew 5. I think it's really clear. He's talking about Gehenna, which is, Greek word for, in New Testament, for what they translate in English as hell, which is the post-judgment, after judgment place, where God is going to throw the wicked, the unrighteous. So here he's saying, hey, if you marry, you have not sinned. If the virgin marries, you have not sinned. So this idea of, remaining as you are sort of thing, it's kind of what it's kind of talking about. It's, in one sense, in a large sense, throughout, like I said, the whole undertone of this whole chapter is remain single, if you can. But like he says in verse 2 and 3, but because there's so much porneia, so much sexual immorality, it's good for each man to have his own spouse. And like I said in verse 8, with the widows and the unmarried, if you can't be self-controlled, then it's better to get married than to burn, right? And so he's basically saying, if you could be single, he's saying it to everybody, if you could be single, be single. It's going to come out much better for you in eternity. That's basically what he's saying. Devote yourself to God, focus on God. In fact, further down he's going to get to where he's recommending, we're going to get into it, where he's getting into the married, and those that are married, you have a tendency to be horizontally focused on your spouse, wives on your husband, husbands on your wives, and you're not really devoting yourself vertically to God. You're not really focused on God so much because you're focusing, laterally or horizontally on your spouse here on earth so much. Whereas the unmarried, the widows, the virgins, they've got their vertical focus on God, and you should be like them, and we're going to get into that. He talks about that down here. And so that's a little bit like what we're talking about here. This is kind of leading into that if you can be single, stay as you are, right? And then it gets down here as well, with regard to the whole Jews and Gentiles both coming into the, being in the faith, engrafted, the Gentiles onto the vine, as John chapter 15 says, Jesus says, "I'm the vine, you are the branches." He says to his Jewish apostles, and of course, all the Old Testament prophecies foretelling that the Gentiles would then, come into the faith as well, and so, both the circumcised, uncircumcised kind of deal here. He's like, if you're circumcised, don't get uncircumcised. Because basically, the point is, in so many of Paul's letters, he talks about, he calls it works of the law in the book of Romans. But works of the law, circumcision, I mean, it's done away with. I mean, it was the seal of the first covenant, the Mosaic law, but the seal in this covenant is through Christ, through baptism. And so he's saying, hey, if you're circumcised, don't get uncircumcised. If you're uncircumcised, don't get circumcised. It doesn't matter. He said what matters is just keeping the commandments of God. And that's what he's saying here in verse 19. Keeping the commandments of God, keeping the commandments of God over Authorized King James. Each one should remain the condition which he was called, right? Verse 20. That's continuing on the same tone, right? Now he's talking about slaves. Hey, are you a slave to somebody? Here, let's read this. So here's ESV. Were you a bondservant when you were called? Basically, it's doulos. It's just a servant. I don't know why they use the word bondservant, but it's just a servant or a slave. It's the same word. Do not be concerned about it, but if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. In other words, take advantage of it. If you can become free, become free. But like Peter says in his letter, submit yourself to your masters in 1 Peter chapter 2. Verse 22, for he who is called in the Lord is a bondservant, as a bondservant is the freeman to the Lord. So on earth you may be a bondservant, but with Christ you've been set free from the kingdom of darkness. So in the things that really matter, you're set free. You're not under this, slavery of Satan and the demons anymore. Kind of idea. Let's see. So that's verse 21. Let's go over here and read. Authorized King James. Art thou called being a servant? Care for it not. If thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord being a servant is the Lord's freeman. Likewise also that he that is called being free is Christ's servant. Ye are bought with a price. He's talking about the blood of Christ. Many passages in the New Testament says that. That's the atonement. But not ye the servants of men. Right? So basically he's saying, don't become servants of men if you can if you can avoid it. But if you are, submit yourself to them. It's very much a theme in many of Paul's letters. So continuing on, verse 23. Well, we already said, look at these other translations, basically the same thing. You're bought with a price. Again, he's talking about the blood of Christ. Verse 24. Brethren, each one is to remain with God in the condition which he was called. So that's in italics. They're throwing that word condition in. The NIV, brothers and sisters, each person has responsibility to God to remain in the situation which they were called, or when God called them. ESV, so brothers, whatever condition each has been called, so let him remain with God. Verse 24 in Authorized King James, brethren, let every man, whether he is called therein, abide with God. And so, yeah, it's basically saying, hey, were you circumcised? Remain that way. Were you a slave? Remain that way. But if you can become, get out of your slavery, get out of that. But he doesn't say that for circumcision. He says it doesn't matter. That was the slavery under the old covenant. Christ has set you free, so you don't have to worry about it. Okay, verse 25. Now concerning virgins, we'll try to Authorized King James. I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one that has obtained mercy in the Lord, as to be faithful. Okay, so we'll go over here. That was Authorized King James. ESV says, now concerning betrothed. Now the word in Greek is parthenos, and so it really is virgin. They kind of threw their opinion in there and said, to somebody betrothed. The idea we're going to see here, where they actually make it this word that is Goon A, which is actually woman, and nera, which means man, throughout the New Testament, throughout in the Koine Greek language. In the New Testament, they don't use a word. I don't know if there is a word that exists for husband and wife. I don't think so. I haven't bumped into that. I've been studying Greek for about 3.5 years. Koine Greek, not modern Greek, but ancient Greek for the New Testament and in the Old Testament. Septuagint, Greek Septuagint. But I'm not familiar with a word for that. I don't think it exists. So, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. In the New Testament, it's Goon A for woman, and it's aner for man. And then based on the context, if the context is talking about marriage, then they translate it as husband or wife. And I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but there would probably be some things like that in English as well. That we kind of think of a word in a particular context where, um, based on the context, oh, okay, we think of it in this meaning or that meaning type thing. But anyway, out of the various translations, I mean, here we even have Good News Translation where they say now concerning what you wrote about the unmarried people, right? So the word is parthenos, which is virgin. They make it unmarried. But we've been talking about unmarried throughout this chapter up to this point, and that's, that's a different word. I mean, that's basically the word, for married, and they throw the alpha in front of it, and that makes it unmarried. But that's not verse 25. It's actually virgin. So as you can see, I mean, just even from this chapter, I mean, throughout all the different English translations, every once in a while, one of the translations in a particular verse does better than the other one. And there is no particular translation, not even a King James, to where it's the best every single time. Because sometimes you'll even find things that are just better in a particular translation. So anyway, since in the context of what we're about to look at, verse 25 is the introduction of the context of what we're about to cover for the next few verses. It said now about virgins, right? Verse 25. That was the NIV actually that said now about virgins, so they actually translated that properly. And then here, NASB, now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I give my opinion by the mercy of the Lord that is trustworthy. So that's verse 25. So the context of what we're getting ready to cover for the next few verses, like I said, is about virgins, right? So it is wrong. I'm 80-90% certain that what I'm about to share is correct. Because like I said, you could translate Goon A as wife, or you could translate, aner as husband, as we've seen, I mean, throughout this chapter. They do that, right? But in this case, since we're talking about virgins, it doesn't make sense. Let's get into it, and we're going to see actually, in my opinion, the NIV, believe it or not, they stuck to the idea of virgins and not being married and translated as woman and man. And I really think the way they're rendering this, to be closer to what Paul intended when he wrote Goon A and aner. So let me start with the NIV actually. Now concerning virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as the one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it's good for a man, not a husband, for a man to remain as he is. And that's pretty much been the theme that we've been reading. It's like, hey, stay as you are. You circumcised, uncircumcised, slave, all these kinds of things. Unmarried, or widow, stay as you are, but because of lack of self-control, that was verse 8. The whole idea, stay as you are if you can. And so getting up to this point, same sort of idea. A man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? So again, Goon A means woman. Could it be wife? Well, we're going to look at these other guesses that these translators did, and I really think they guessed wrong. So, are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. Do not look for a woman. But if you do marry, see again, verse 25. Now about virgins. This context is about virginity. And now all of a sudden we're going to transition from virginity, not the context of virginity, and magically, verse 26, 27, and we're making a wife and husband. That doesn't make sense. That's why right here what the NIV is doing, they're nailing it. I'm telling you. So just let that saute a little bit and let that sink in and see if that doesn't make sense. Go over and read it many, many times, and I think you'll agree. Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a woman. Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, because again, we're talking about virgins, you have not sinned. And if the virgin marries, she has not sinned. Now, that verse right there in verse 28 is really important because, going back to my slides, if you remember when I laid out the outline of things that are overlooked in this chapter, verse 1, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Verse 2 and 3, but hey, because of the sexual immorality, it's good for a wife to have her husband, a husband to have a wife, and that's really good. And then we keep reading, and we see a problem with lack of self-control. Satan tempting people, there in verse 6, 7, getting up to verse 8. Now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it's good for them to stay unmarried, right? So, see what we're talking about here? We're talking about somebody staying single, kind of idea. And stay as you were before. And so let's get back down here. And so people could misunderstand what Paul's saying and go and start going around saying, Paul's saying that you can't get married. And so this is why every once in a while in Paul's letters, he slams on the brakes and says, wait a minute, let me make sure you guys are catching what I'm saying. Let me make sure you're catching my drift. And so he says, it is not wrong to get married. It's just a really good idea. That's what he's saying. So here, NIV says, but for those who marry will face troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. So let's go and compare verse 28 and some of these others. So here's NASB. But if you marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life. And I'm trying to spare you this, right? Good News Translation. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, committed a sin. But if an unmarried woman marries, she hasn't committed a sin. But I would rather spare you the everyday troubles that married people will have, right? So that's good news. Here we go, ESV. If you do marry, you have not sinned, and if the betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Again, we're talking about virgins. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles. I want to spare you this, right? So this is the idea he's saying. He's saying it's good for a man not to touch a woman. It's good for the unmarried and widows to stay single. But hey, if you can't exercise self-control, get married because it's better to marry than to burn. Down here, he's talking about virgins. And he's saying, hey, if you're not pledged to a woman, then, stay single. That's what he's been saying all along, right? But hey, if you are pledged, then don't try and get out of it, because let your yes be yes and no be no, as James says, the Epistle of James. And James is just echoing the words of our Lord. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, do not take oaths. You've heard it of old, and he refers to Moses. He said, but I say to you, and he's basically saying, do not ever let there be any contrast or distinction in your words. Always let your yes be yes. Everything that you say, do it. Or else, like Jesus says, everything else comes from the kingdom of darkness. Everything else comes from evil. James says in the Epistle of James, when he's echoing the words of our Lord, he says, or else be condemned. Right? So anyway, picking back up here, he wants to save us the problems of married life. But he's saying if you do marry, you have not sinned, if that's what you choose to do, right? And again, he says it's good to be married anyway because of sexual immorality. So again, it's better to be married than to burn, right? So, and like he says Jesus says in Matthew 5, with the idea of porneia or sexual immorality, if a man is lusting after a woman and he can't control himself, it's better for him to pluck out his eye than to burn, right? It's better for him to cut off his hand than to burn. And so same sort of idea. So verse 26, good news. Considering your present distress, I think it's better for a man to stay as he is. And so 26 in ESV, I think that in my view of the present distress, it's good for a person to remain as he is. And so as we saw over here in the NIV, again, I mean, they're nailing it. They're saying, are you pledged to a woman? Over here, you're going to see all of these translations, including the King James, of talking as if they're married, right? Which is in completely undermining and not making sense in the context we've been talking about. We've been leading up to this point, verse 10 and 11, where it talked about people being married, and it says, woman, do not separate from your husband, or wife, do not separate from your husband. And if you do, you got two choices: either remain alone or be reconciled. That's it, right? If we fast forward down to verse 39, a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if he dies, if he sleeps, actually, literally what it says. But that context used in the Old Testament, New Testament, both Old Testament and New Testament, conveys the idea of dying. So our body sleeps, and at the resurrection they'll be raised again. Wife is bound as long as the husband lives, but if her husband dies, she's free to marry whoever she wishes, but as long as he's a Christian, as long as he's in the Lord, right? They're all pretty much saying the same thing. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about you get married, you're bound. So this right here, translating Goon A as wife and Aner as husband, when we're talking about the introduction in verse 25, now concerning virgins. In other words, the theme of what we're looking at in these verses is about virgins. And so that's why this passage here, the NIV nailed it. So now concerning virgins. And he's talking about Goon A. Okay, finishing up part 3C, Divorce and Remarriage. Up until this point, we have seen that from 1 Corinthians verse 25 to 28, that's what we were just looking at, that it could possibly be translated, and we're talking about the word Goon A, could be translated as either woman or wife, and just the context itself, it could be as, four translations we're looking at, look at it as married people. Then it goes on to, the verse that says, but if you marry, you've not sinned. Or we start out verse 25 conveys the idea of now concerning virgins. And then what follows is in the context of unmarried virgins, right? So that's what we're looking at. In other words, when it gets to the point of, and if you've married, you've not sinned, it's talking about never been married before and then marry. And why would he say you've not sinned? Well, as we've looked at throughout this series, and when I say series, I'm not saying going all the way back to part 1. I'm really referring to part 3A, 3B, and now 3C, everything we've looked up to this point. And I guess maybe even part 1 and part 2 and some points, we've looked at this as well, is that we're talking about unmarried, we're talking about virgins, we're talking about widows. Not to mention verse 1 said it's good for a man not to touch a woman. And the advice from Paul throughout is this underlying tone of the preferences for you to imitate me and focus on the kingdom of God, just like Jesus did in Matthew 19 on eunuchs. Be a voluntary eunuch. Anyone can accept this, should accept this, he said. And so that's the sort of idea we're talking about, leading up to a point to where it says, but if you've married, you've not sinned. That's why he would say that, right? Doesn't that make sense? So anyway, so what is the internal evidence to the text, which it might be? I've kind of already just covered that, but let's see here. So as we said, the NIV translated as in the context of an engaged couple, where it's taken verse 25 very seriously, where it says now concerning virgins, whereas the authorized King James version, not to mention New King James and other variants of King James versions, NASB, ESV, Good News Translation. I mean, they're all looking at it as if they're married. And then when you get to the verse where it says, "But if you've married, you've not sinned," that's like, whoa, wait a minute now. Now you're conveying the idea that it's okay to remarry, and that together with the exception clause in Matthew 19:9, which we're going to look at in part 5, we're going to look at the oldest manuscripts that we have that and I'll just tell you, that actually show that it read like Matthew 5:32, which doesn't make an allowance for anyone to remarry. And all it says in Matthew 5:32 is, who's to blame if the wife remarries? Is the wife remarrying, committing adultery like it says in Mark 10? Is it all her fault? Or if she's committing porneia, then yes. If she's not committing porneia, then it's the husband's fault. Or at least he shares in the blame. And so that's what Matthew 5:32 is about. And so in the oldest manuscripts we have, that's how Matthew 19:9 reads. And so we're going to look at evidence, internal evidence within those first 12 verses, even in the modern renderings that we have now, except for verse 9. Just looking at verse 10, the manuscripts that we use in Greek, what's a better translation of those words. We'll look at some of those words that they kind of soften it and kind of translate it in a way that's not really like the way that those same words are used in the rest of other places in the New Testament, not to mention other writings. So we'll look at that, and we'll also look at with regard to the early church. Did they talk about an exception clause, and what kind of light can that shed and stuff? So anyway, so that's in part 5 that's coming up. So this is part 3C, and so we're finishing up part 3 when we get to part D, which will be right after this. And so it'll be part 3A, 3B, 3C, 3D is all part 3. As I had mentioned, it just was way over 2 hours, and so I divided it up into these little segments. And so, but part 4 is going to actually take a look at what the early church says, and it just makes sense to look at that first before we get into what I just described about part 5. And so part 5 will be predicated on what we've already looked at and established from the early church, and then looking at the Greek manuscripts and the oldest Greek manuscripts, as I said, where does the evidence point? Does it point that there's actually any allowance at all for remarriage, so that we actually can dismiss passages that are very clear, like Mark 10, Luke 16, verse 18, and even to some degree Matthew 5:32. People seem to just overlook them. And so even here, what we're looking at is 1 Corinthians 7:25 through 28. If it's translated in a way that doesn't really align with the evidence from verse 25, it says, now concerning virgins, and the concluding point that he says, where it says, I want to spare you that, nevertheless, looking right here, nevertheless, such as those that marry is kind of what he's implying. Such as these, he's just talking about those that marry, will have trouble in the flesh, will have trouble in this life, will have trouble in the flesh, and Paul wants to spare them that. So he wants to spare them of getting married. And then we even get further down as we keep reading after verse 28, and we're going to get into that in part D, where we're going to see that he's continuing on this theme of pointing out why it's good not to be married. And he says if you are married, that you need to live as if you're not married. And then we'll see how he's saying the reason for that is because those that are unmarried, virgins and widows, have a vertical focus on God, and they're not just focused on the things of this life and on their spouse and on pleasing them. And so just the whole totality of 1 Corinthians 7, Paul keeps giving all these different reasons of why it's good not to marry. And so just like here, verse 28, he says, I want to spare you this, that you don't marry. Then it's pretty obvious that in verse 26 and 27, that Goon A should not be wife, but actually be woman. And as as we just were looking at, that, it's the idea of a woman, being, betrothed or engaged to a man, and the idea of if he's engaged to not get out of that. And so, yeah, so as we, again, recap verse 1, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. 2 and 3 says, well, because of the fornication issue, it's because of that it's good for them to marry. Verse 8, he's saying if you're not married and you're a widow, don't marry. But if you have a problem with self-control, hellfire hangs in the balance. Again, like we said up here in verse 2 and 3, because of fornication potential, it's good to go ahead and get married. If you have a self-control problem, go ahead and get married so that Satan doesn't tempt you. And then again, looking at what Jesus said with regard to eunuchs, the 3 types, and of course the one type, the last type of the 3, is voluntary in Matthew 19, 11, and 12, that it's good that anybody that can do that should do that. And so, and eventually we'll get into other videos outside of this divorce and remarriage topic. I encourage you to come on back, because the early church has so woken up my eyes, to recognize the convoluted sort of English translations of the word choices that they've used, translating things like sober, instead of just plainly put it in an everyday language like we use, like self-control, or temperance, using a word that we use all the time, self-control. We all know what that means. Some people, temperance, what is that? Soberness. Oh, that's talking about alcohol and drinking. No. And so we're going to see that so much in the New Testament, it's all over the place, about that when you become a Christian, you train yourself in godliness, exercising self-control, and predicated on you doing that and denying the flesh, then you're walking with the Spirit. You can't do both. And we're going to see that. It's right in the New Testament. And so when we're looking at that, we're going to see if we're walking with the Spirit, only then are we being sanctified. Only then are we being purified. Moving towards this idea that's not very well translated also in English, but it's this idea of 3 words that are scattered. Sometimes they translate the word, teleos as the adjective form, but there's verb forms and noun forms of this word. But it's, if you take all 3, the way that sometimes they translate as complete, sometimes they translate as perfect, sometimes they translate as mature. If you bind those 3 together, now you understand what that's saying. because in Jesus' parables, when he's referring to fruit, he uses this adjective to describe when it's fully ripe. That's when all of a sudden the farmer that planted that tree, his intent was to come and pluck that fruit, and that was the intent of planting the tree in the first place. And this is why God plants his Holy Spirit as the seed in a cleansed, sanctified soul with the blood of Christ, and he's coming back to bear fruit. He's coming back soon to bear fruit. And wherever he doesn't find the fruit of holiness, like he said, when the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on the earth? See, faith on the earth, it's proven through the fruit of the tree. Jesus said, in the Sermon on the Mount, I think it was either Matthew 6 or Matthew 7, but he said, you will know a tree by its fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit. Cannot. And a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. He said, and he spoke that way in a lot of different ways. Anyway, so I'm diverging from the point here, but we'll get into all that kind of stuff. But eventually, if you stick around, keep coming back, I encourage you to do so, we're going to see it's right in the New Testament. The idea of self-control. Now, if you're the type of people that aren't really seeking truth, and you just kind of want to just be told what you want to hear, so you can enjoy your life and everything or whatever, and just kind of just plug a little cork in your the hole that's burning in your chest and your heart there, your conscience, and it's bothering you and stuff, then there's plenty of preachers around that'll scratch your itching ears and tell you what you want to hear, and you can just enjoy your life and just put your soul on the casino table and roll the roulette wheel there or whatever, and that's fine. And Jesus said the broad road that leads to destruction, that many find it. And there's plenty of them out that'll do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not trying to be popular. I'm just trying to save souls. And I hope that we can high five each other, when Christ comes back and stuff, and all be united together as part of the virgin bride that has purified ourselves, and being united with the groom that's coming back. It's going to claim his church. So, all right. So anyway, back on point here. So, as we said, the evidence points to the fact that verse 25, which now concerning virgins, through 28 is talking about virgins, talking about people who weren't married, and they were either, whatever word you want to use, they were engaged, they were betrothed, or whatever. And so he said, don't try to get out of that commitment, because he said down here, in Jesus' words, he said, let your yes be yes and no be no. Everything else comes from the evil one. And then James echoes the words of our Lord and says, let your yes be yes and no be no, or else be condemned. Right? So it's really a big deal. This is why Jesus preached in the Sermon on the Mount, do not take oaths. Don't ever let anything that you say there be any contrast to where it's like, well, no, I really mean it now. No, you always mean what you say. And so, so just considering all the evidence of Paul's point, it was obvious that Paul was speaking of virgins, unmarried people, an unmarried man, that it's not a sin to marry, right? So for him to break that pledge is what we're talking about. For him to break that commitment to the woman that he said, let's be married. He's saying, no, don't let your yes be yes and no be no. Don't go back on that. But if you can get out of that commitment, in other words, if she says, well, if you don't want to marry, I'm okay that too. I'm okay with that too, because I was also thinking about taking the voluntary eunuch, approach that Jesus preaches, just devoting myself, as a virgin to the Lord, or as a widow to the Lord, or whatever the case may be. And so that's what Paul's saying. He's saying if you can get out of it, then do so. And then he's saying it's better to not be married. He's like, you'll have problems in the flesh, and I want to spare you this. And so when we get into part 3, we're going to pick up right where we left off, from we were in the scriptures there, and I've got this little presentation, this little PowerPoint sort of thing here, giving a little summary of what we were just looking at. But we'll pick up right where we left off of that, and we'll finish up 1 Corinthians 7, and then we'll conclude what Paul says in general on divorce and remarriage in part 3D from there. So come on back, and God bless you.